meeting to order, and I'm looking around the room for potential public comment. I don't see any possible commenters here, so we'll move on from that. I think the first order of business is at least one presentation from staff. Is that right?
Yeah, a couple weeks back when you were all talking about the parks need, some questions came up about that, and so I was able to review the meeting that I had missed, and so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what I know and hopefully address some of your questions. So there were kind of a number of themes, but one of the main questions I heard asked was, how is the park need figured? Is it based on a per capita, so many acres per thousand of individuals, or is it geographic? The answer is it is not based on per capita. And even the PROS plan is not based on per capita. On one page in the document, they do kind of reference some national standards and how Eugene compares to that, but that's purely illustrative, and actually the entire parks industry and the Parks and Recreation national organization has completely moved away from providing any kind of standards around per capita, because they recognize that all communities are different, and that what works for New York City is not necessarily going to work for Eugene, Oregon. So they realize it's truly more of a unique issue. And so the way that we have integrated the parks need into Envision Eugene is looking at all of the acquisition projects that are proposed in the project and priority list, which is an adopted plan by City Council. And we have, I have a little matrix here where we catalog all of those acquisitions, and we identify which types of lands they'll occur on. So is it on low density residential land or commercial land? And so we can kind of identify the land need as it relates to parks. We also separate out lands that are already protected, but that may become a park someday. So maybe we'll be acquiring some additional stream corridor. That is land that is already not considered buildable in our buildable land inventory, and so that doesn't necessarily have to come out of our inventory, but it is accounted for. So I can tell you that the total number of acres we're planning for parks inside the current urban growth boundary is 175 acres of newly acquired parkland. It's estimated that approximately 80 acres of that land would occur in areas that are already protected and not included in our buildable inventory. And so as far as reducing our actual buildable inventory, we're only reducing it by about 95 acres. And we even take that a step further and identify which types of lands between LDR, MDR, commercial, and government education those fall into. So that was one of the questions. Another question was, well, what was the planning period that the parks plan was intended for? It was adopted in 2005, and it was planned to be a 20-year document, so kind of through 2025. However, as luck would have it, the population estimate for 2025 is roughly the same population estimate that we are now working under for Envision Eugene. So although this project planning occurred 5 years earlier, we were planning for roughly the same amount of population. More importantly, though, is the fact that this is a geographically based plan. And so all of the parks that are inside the urban growth boundary, that hasn't changed. So that need remains the same. There's 2 areas that are not covered in the parks plan that we have talked about in Envision Eugene. The first one is expansion areas. Obviously, those weren't identified when we did the parks plan. So if there is a need to provide parks in any of those expansion areas, we need to look at that. And that's one of the things that we've talked about doing in doing some master planning around expansion areas. The second thing is the parks plan is based, as I said, on geographical distribution. It does not take into account density, and so, concentrations of people. And so that is something that we have recommended that we do in the future. And so there's a couple strategies in Envision Eugene that talk about doing area planning, where when we're looking at densifying some of these areas, we need to make sure we have additional parks, and then that needs to get translated over into the parks plan. So,
if I could just jump in, I think that most directly answers your question, Commissioner Jaworski, around density. So I just wanted to make that connection for Carolyn, who wasn't there that day.
if there are concerns that the parks plan is underserving certain areas of town, it's, that needs to be brought to the Parks Department's attention. And this is, a document that can be updated. But through Envision Eugene, we made a very conscious decision not to open up the parks plan. It was done in, fairly, 5 years ago, which is pretty recent. It had a tremendous amount of support and had a lot of public involvement. So we made a very, clear decision that we weren't going to mess with it. We were going to use it as is. If there are changes that, that if there are areas that are lacking in that plan, I think those need to be brought up with parks, and absolutely we can, address those as we move forward with implementation. But I guess the two areas that we're clearly identifying a need for in Envision Eugene are adding parks where we are densifying, so in some of those corridor areas, and then making sure that we have good parks in our expansion areas. Let's see. Oh, and there was a question about how much of the parkland is designated in low-density residential, and that's about 90 acres. I think that might have been Commissioner Baker's question. And I can go into infinite detail on each one of these projects if you would like. Maybe at a later time, though. So, I don't know. Does that help clarify things?
Your number two, the planning period, in 2005, when this was adopted, although you did indicate it possibly would be considered for amendments. At that point in time, I don't believe there was an emphasis on walkable neighborhoods, community parks. Is that not correct? That's something new that's through Envision Eugene?
No, actually, I mean, the whole basis for the parks plan is making sure that there is a park within a walking distance of all residents. So, and there's different standards. For a neighborhood park, it's a half mile. So a neighborhood park within a half mile of all residents. Community parks, it's a little further. It's more like 2 miles. And that is in this plan, and I can show you where that is.
Well, and I would just also add that the policy framework has been in place since Transplan was adopted. Transplan had 3 strategies that included transportation system improvements, transit, and land use measures, but together they promoted walkability and nodal development. And so it's actually been a key point as we move forward with Envision Eugene that a lot of the efficiency measures and things that other communities first looked to put in place, we've had in place in a policy framework for many, many years in our town. So it made it harder for us to get a little bit more gain in our policy set. So I would say there's almost 20 years of history of having that.
I guess my question would be, I think one of the things that I heard coming up in our previous discussion on this was the timing of acquisitions of parkland. And is that in the park plan then as far as how that all happens? Because I think the concern that was expressed was as we expand and as we grow, then the pressure gets put on lands that maybe we've identified but not yet acquired, and the price on those goes up. And then that just might be self-defeating.
Well, I think that's a relevant concern. Regarding prioritizing of acquisitions, They are prioritized in the plan, and there's even a bond measure passed that set aside funding to acquire a number of those parks, and some of the neighborhood parks have been difficult to acquire because there just isn't the property to do it. However, those are certainly a priority, and I think that there is already funding established for those.
So there is a mechanism to do that, and
There is, but the challenge, the tricky point is, as I said before, they didn't necessarily look at where the density was going to go. Where are those really urbanizing areas? And so that it is incumbent upon us to, number one, identify the park needs in those areas, and then number two, identify funding strategies. And, that's work that has to happen still.
And I guess I would say that's the type of recommendation that the Planning Commission can make to the council as we do parks acquisitions. Please keep, that's something to have in place. It's not a specific tool, but it's a overall guidance. I think that would be helpful for the council to hear if the Planning Commission chooses to do that.
May I ask a question?
Oh, sorry, John, yes.
That's okay. Could you speak to the perception of some that the priorities have shifted towards acquiring South Hills because they're available?
The priorities have shifted what?
Acquisition priorities have shifted because of availability of parcels in the South Hills that we take advantage of. Is that a misnomer, or is there some value to that?
Are you referring to Ridgeline Trail acquisitions?
Primarily, yes.
I don't know that Ridgeline was ever prioritized over, say, for instance, neighborhood parks. However, there have been a lot of efforts underway to locate neighborhood parks to purchase. It's more challenging because, as we all know, the land is harder to come by, whereas the land is available or has been available for Ridgeline Park acquisitions. However, to my knowledge, and I'm not super up on this, the funding for neighborhood and community parks has remained whole. There was dollar amounts identified for the different types of parks. And with a lot of the Ridgeline acquisitions, we were able to find state and federal grant partners, and so we're able to leverage those dollars and take them a lot further than we thought we would be able to, but not at the expense of the money for the inside the urban growth boundary parks.
Okay. And there's no limitation within the Parks Department to process those parcels. I'm just trying to get to the question of, are we shifting our efforts to the Ridgeline Trail rather than neighborhood?
No, and my understanding is that they've kind of tapped out their money with Ridgeline acquisitions, so there probably isn't a lot more going on at this point. There may be stuff that I don't know of, but that's my general understanding.
I would certainly say that if there's an interest at some point, we could certainly have the Parks Planning Manager come and talk to you.
Yeah.
Planning Commission, I think that could be interesting. But I just want to make sure that the takeaway, which I just heard from Carolyn, is it's not that one is prioritized over the other, but given funding and availability and challenges, one moves forward, another doesn't, because there's barriers to the other moving forward. It's not because of the priority.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Duncan?
So, during presentations at the public forum, we've talked about particularly the expansion area down in the Bailey Hill area. Is it my understanding that you just said that during the planning process for that lands, that we would also consider additional parklands in that process? So actual expansion could be something more than the lands that we've been discussing at these public forums.
We've actually been discussing expansion for parklands at the public forums, but maybe we can.
Well,
But we didn't talk about expansion of parkland in that growth area, that expansion area.
So for the expansion areas identified for residential, I think your question is, if we identify a need for additional parkland, might that
Right.
grow the acreage need?
Yes.
I think that's potential. if we look at the specific areas we're talking about, Clear Lake is adjacent to a very large park, probably not going to need anything more there. Possibly Bailey Hill, Gimple Hill, haven't looked at it. There's a lot of Ridgeline Park in the vicinity, however, probably be lacking more in the neighborhood park, which are generally small and probably wouldn't have too big of an impact on the amount of land needed.
Right.
But it's possible. It's something we need to look at.
And I think a follow-up to that, if there is a plan to expand and we master plan the area and it does show for parks, I think it needs to be very specific as to that those parks will be paid for by the city, or those lands are, because that was sort of the plan in Royal Node at one time, that all the public land or park land was going to be purchased, and then the city sort of said, no, we're not going to do that, and it was sort of left for the property owners to sort of find somebody to buy their parkland, which was the problem, is, you know, if you own 4 acres and it's going to be the park, what private developer wants to pay for it? So, I mean, I think we need to, and the original
Yeah.
Royal Node plan actually talked about acquisition of parks by the city, but it was sort of dropped.
I believe actually that that one of the proposed neighborhood park acquisitions is in the Royal Node. So
Okay.
the city has kind of come around to that one.
Oh, okay.
The original plan of Royal Node, I think, showed 2 very small neighborhood
Right.
parks, and we've kind of looked at it. That's not a very functional way to operate and maintain parks, and so we've looked at collapsing that into one larger neighborhood park site. But it is on, as far as I know, it's on the acquisition list.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions or discussions around parks? That means I think we're ready to proceed on and talk about, complete our discussion around economic development. I'd like to take a moment to just set some time expectations for the meeting here. Looking to the commissioners for a sense of how much time we feel we're going to need to complete our discussion for economic development. Is it a half hour? Is it 45 minutes? What percentage of the meeting should we devote to that? Commissioner Duncan?
Well, based on the TRG work, we need about 150 hours.
Okay, 150 hours.
But they already did the work, so we don't need to.
Yeah, we're more efficient.
I hope so.
I was thinking like a half an hour,
Well, I
but
would suggest no later than 12:45.
I don't have this in front of me, so 12:45, no later. So 1 hour for,
Or less.
or less. So Land for Jobs is supposed to go from now till 12:45. Okay, let's shoot for that, and maybe we'll take less. And then we'll work on any changes or additions or strategy for completing the recommendation. Sound good? So for opening the discussion around economic development, was there any other input from staff that we were expecting or that they were expecting to make, or are we just moving to discussion now? Sounds like we're moving to discussion.
Yes.
Commissioner,
Well, I thought we were going to hear more information about brownfield development and consolidation of small parcels. Is there no information on that?
We do, I think Jason has come prepared with information about our industrial land supply, and that I think will inform that discussion. So we thought we'd wait and see if it comes up, and you want to launch into what you have there, Jason?
I can talk a bit about the work that the TRG has been doing around brownfields. In particular, there are 2 large sites in the community, both of which are former log ponds. One still is a log pond, and one has been filled. Both of them are large sites that represent good opportunities for land in the future. However, significant remediation would be needed. So those 2 sites, one is at 5th and Seneca, and where did I put that? One is at 5th and Seneca. The other is the old Georgia Pacific Mill Pond. That site is the GP site is about 64 acres. The 5th and Seneca site is 22. 5th and Seneca is the one that has the pond that's been filled, but there's still a lot of concerns about the stability of the site, and that additional remediation would be needed to make that site actually buildable. The GP site actually still has a pond. It's about a 20-acre pond on it, so significant work would need to be done there. Those are the two big sites that the TRG and other committees that have worked on this have identified that would, in a larger scale, help address brownfield redevelopment. It's likely that neither of those sites would produce acreage comparable to their current acreage. Something less than that would end up being used. There still are likely smaller sites hanging around town that it is still our strategy to work on as we go forward. We're not, at this point, inventorying all the 1 and 2 acre industrial brownfield sites simply because they don't necessarily impact our need, since we have enough supply of small sites, but we want to be able to identify those so that we can say what needs to be done to perhaps make this 2 acre site that's been sitting around for 50 years. It's trying to fill in those holes in the community. So TRG's been focusing more on the larger sites, but we know there are smaller sites out there that staff will focus on in the future.
And it is important to remember that one of the recommendations in the plan is to assemble 4 sites. In which category?
I think it's 4 sites.
10 to 20?
Yeah, 4 sites that are assembly, whether it be smaller than 10 acres or sites between 10 and 20, to the final objective to be to produce 4 sites in the 10 to 20 range. And so the TRG has been doing work on finding those sites primarily through, are there any that could be redeveloped or that are similar on the residential side to partially vacant, so developed industrial lots that might have significant unused space on them. So they've been focusing on filling out that part of the recommendation based on those lots, but also noting that there are assembly opportunities too. But that's not something that recently they've spent a lot of time on identifying which ones to assemble.
That's another follow-up question. Sure, John. So you've said what and where. Have you done any work on how?
The how is a bit tougher. I know that community development currently has a grant in, or was working on a grant to help secure funding to scope all of our brownfield sites in the community and identify what would be needed to move forward. I can also say that we know that both state and federal funding for brownfield grant and assistance type programs has been decreasing. Both of those have suffered under budget cuts at the state and federal level. So there's not as much out there as there used to be for brownfield redevelopment. Doesn't mean it's not there. It just means it's going to be tough. So part of that grant work that community development has been doing will be identifying what needs to be done and also identifying the sources that are out there.
Assuming we get it.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, and on that point, I think that's one of the framing points, certainly has been in staff conversations with council to date, is that where there has been a lot of interest in having a higher number of brownfield sites redeveloped versus expanding for industrial, but we have to be realistic in what the capacity and not be overly aspirational, because it's such a heavy lift to do that. I think it's absolutely has to be within our policy set and focus to do that, because it makes good sense to do that. But we also need to recognize what the barriers are to do that, or what the challenges are. And so those points have been made at council. We'll continue to make them. I think that's certainly something that Planning Commission can focus on, letting them understand the lift to get to the implementation. But then some of the questions you're asking are really about implementation strategies that we'll then move forward to as we believe it will be included as a policy direction.
I guess my concern is that we said we would try to do this. We've identified it as challenging. My concern is that we don't drop it off the list because it's too tough. But I'm hearing you say that's not.
No, in fact, we're already, as Jason said, we're already moving forward as with a number of the policies in here, or the implementation measures associated with policies. We're not waiting for a plan to be adopted to look into things that we already have. We've already had programs in place for a number of these things, including brownfield redevelopment. It's surfaced as a higher priority. We're going to continue to work on it, but we won't wait till adoption to begin looking for opportunities for brownfield redevelopment money.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
I don't know exactly, looking at any section for land for jobs, or even if sometimes it's related. I know that Carolyn sent out the Regional Prosperity Economic Development Plan. I want to say that was actually impressed on the amount of things that are being done and the agencies involved in that. So and also the areas that they covered. There was one thing, and I probably missed it, but it didn't jump out at me, and I didn't think I saw it in there. And that's like, and I went through this myself when when you're doing loans, you go, how many jobs did you create? That's in there, but the factors that I don't see in there is the pay scale level of the jobs. And I think, number one, that should be definitely something that, a factor that we monitor, and number two, it's a potential factor that could be an incentive to boost development activities. If you're creating better jobs, the city could, or higher paying jobs, that the city comes out with some kind of incentives because of that, versus someone else who's coming in and just creating. I just wanted to mention that, and I thought a lot of good work there that's being done.
Jason, could you talk a little bit about the key industries? Because I believe that addresses wage levels.
It does, yeah. Most of the key industries that have been targeted by that plan are industries that have wages higher than our current average wage. And it's not an absolute guarantee that there would be, because certainly there are different business models within each sector. I do think the point that you've raised is a good one around monitoring for the jobs that we do have, so that we can actually say what impact have we had, what kind of jobs are we creating, are they of the wage profile we thought. So I think that's a good add to what we look at in the future.
Okay, I understand that your target industries will have supposedly higher paying skills, but I would think that in this strategy there's more than just addressing targeted industries. There's also expansion and retention of existing businesses, and I think that jobs factor is something that you're looking at there also. Sorry I didn't say it clearly the first time.
Makes sense.
Mr. Duncan. Back a little bit to brownfields. There's really there's two actual ways, I think, that to look at a brownfield is one is the two sites that were talked about. Is basically those are located in industrial areas that likely could not be rezoned for something. So the way that you have to deal with those is you've got to step up and pay to have the problem solved, and quite often it's many times what the property ends up being worth. So it's a community that has to make that decision. The other way, and we've talked about this a lot with sort of either a rezone or a change in the way our zoning is it would be good as this process moves forward, and I think this has already been done, where we identify a lot of the smaller sites that may not have been developed, but through a kind of a rezoning process or changing the way the zoning functions, particularly out on West 11th, which is being done, does assist in resolving that problem, because now you can create a higher value out of the land, which means that you can actually do the work necessarily and achieve that. One of the problems we've had with our industrial land in our community for probably nearly 20 years is it hasn't changed in value hardly at all over that 20-year period. So there's no incentive for somebody who owns it to try to fix a problem with it, where if we actually find the rezone or a change in that zoning, then we can maybe establish a way for people to be able to afford to fix the problem because they're going to get a better use out of it. So I know that we've talked about that. I just wanted to kind of bring that up a little bit for the commission to understand that those things are sort of part of what we're doing, is trying to let the market also help drive the fix of a lot of sites out there.
I concur with what Commissioner Duncan indicated, in that market-driven is going to set some priorities where you might look at something or a business expansion within that you're going to help address and look at particular sites. But without that market-driven component, then is there any sort of, or will that come out later in a comprehensive, where is like a list of priority of what are these things we're going to do first? Understanding that some of them are much more costly than others, but what is the strategy as to, unless it's, if there is no market driving it, what are we doing? And I don't get a sense of that, because I see all of it and I'm saying, well, I know we can't do all of it. And just to say we're not going to do this because it's more costly, where does it fit into our overall strategy of what we need to do first?
I guess what I'm thinking on that is that I mean, it's obviously a high priority, and as I mentioned before, one of the key tasks that we have as staff in bringing this recommendation and information in front of council to make their decision is to make sure that they have all the information they need to make the decisions on which policies to include. So in the case of something like this, where it is going to take more effort and more prioritization, and that for us to actually start to see the value in those lands and see the redevelopment, they have to make specific decisions on funding or seeking funding or implementing a strategy or creating a work focus on, going after federal funds or state funds. And, I mean, you might remember that John's recommendation when he came and gave you the presentation, he talked about this, not Brownfield specifically, although it's wrapped in, but that the wage issue and the retention issue was really one of the key strategies in dealing with our housing affordability issue, our community gap between affordability and wages. And so it doesn't work unless you do all these pieces. The devil's always in the detail. We need to, once the council says yes, go back and go forward and do this in whatever format they decide, modifications or as presented. We then go forward and start putting together a package. The package will start to put in some of the details that you're asking questions about. So I think you're raising exact points that we will be including in that. If you're going to do this, then you have to do this, this, and this. So I think you're pointing out the things that we are aware are part of the package. We want to make sure council understands that if they say, yes, redevelop 2 brownfields, we're not overreaching by saying redevelop 6 brownfields in 5 years, because that would be unrealistic and not likely to be successful given the current funding availability. But that would come back and say, we need to be working with the state on blah, blah, blah. We need to be, all the specific, what is it going to take to actually make it happen? So those happen in the next phase once you get the policy direction to do this.
If I could just add, I think it's the prioritization issue is something that I've heard you bring up before, and I think it's an excellent comment, really, to include in the Planning Commission's letter to the City Council that, there are a number of strategies here, and maybe the next step is to begin prioritizing those. So as Lisa said, we're not there yet, but I think it's an important step and something that you could choose to weigh in on.
Maybe I missed something, but on page 2-4, the land for jobs on the diagram, there are a number, 4 areas, 5 areas that are designated as areas to study for flexible employment designation. And I know in the technical papers that's kind of talked about a little bit more, but I think I missed it. I don't see it ending up in any of the strategies as a tactic. It's just listed on the map, and I think that might be worthwhile specifying. So I will suggest that.
Could you
That's
clarify
an excellent
what
point.
employment designation really means?
Yeah, it's back here in the, I won't
thank
be
you.
able to put my finger right on it, but it's
Way in the back,
in the back. Technical reports, John.
Thank you, I'll find it.
It's in there.
So I think Jason was pointing at 2-12, but we're still trying to find it.
Or page, I'm wondering if page 2.2 of the recommendation, item 2A, talks about adding flexibility as well as in West Eugene to a commercial or flexible employment designation.
Oh, where's that, Jason?
On page 2.2, so in the actual pillar portion, there's a mention of flexible employment designation.
It's under strategy 2, item A.
Item
Oh,
There it is.
Thank you again.
More flexible
Oh, okay.
employment last.
Okay, gotcha, okay. All right, very good. I haven't had it underlined.
Sorry, yes.
And isn't that also, if I'm understanding that, maybe definition, kind of what we've talked about a little bit as far as how our original definitions in the zoning code, let's say, for commercial and industrial over the last 30 years have changed. I mean, our definitions haven't changed, but the uses have changed. And so the idea that a use is commercial or industrial today based on what our code says is kind of out of date, because that whole dynamic has just gone totally different than what it was back then. And is that kind of what that flexibility
Exactly.
gets at? It
The
allows
I-1,
us,
the commercial,
yeah,
looking more at, looking less at the particular use and more at the function or the compatibility and trying to find greater flexibility, because there's a number of examples where folks have been scratching their heads over why something's allowed and something's not allowed, and so wanting to make sure that we address that is exactly.
okay.
Would you go through that again? I'm sorry.
So the I-1 is one example of a particular, designation or zone that has prescribed some things being allowed and other things being not being allowed. That's not necessarily intuitive. And when you look at, is it more about form and function or impact than it is about use? And so just as industries change, as commercial uses change, we probably need something a little more flexible so that we can allow more things to happen where it makes sense for them to happen, and not strictly by saying, nope, it's not a listed use, can't happen. So I think it addresses some of the...
Even being able to identify a particular use
Right.
into one of the categories
Exactly.
that doesn't fit anything.
I mean,
you know.
you've been someone to bring up this point up for a long time, and I think that it's part of that conversation that's meant to be captured. Without going into specifics, that will come in I'm going to say this a lot, that will come in the implementation as we go forward, but it's meant to capture exactly it's the policy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Actually, just to follow up, I'm happy to hear that because, as you've said, it's getting to the point where our lists are so old and antiquated, you can't find a whole lot of uses anymore. And I know that I have a number of clients that can't believe that they can't do something in a
Right.
certain zone because it's not on a list somewhere. Matter of fact,
We
it
hear
doesn't show
from
up
all
on
of them.
any list anywhere. I would be very happy if we got rid of all of our use lists.
Maybe that's a goal we can aspire to, but this one addresses that issue.
Okay, thanks.
And in a broader context in that regard, too, and I think Jeff brought this up last week, the key industries that are identified in this as having the greatest potential for us, I would suggest we need to be pretty cautious with that. It's great to go after them, but as quickly as technology changes, Hynix, Sony, these things come and go now so quickly that we need to be able to take advantage of whatever, I would suggest whatever opportunity is out there and be more in terms of parameters rather than being too reliant or conveying the perception that these are the ones we're going after.
And I think that that's a great comment that the Planning Commission should make in their recommendation to council, because it's not intended to be restrictive. It's tending to recognize and reflect another plan that's been regionally adopted that it has a lot of good strategies in it, but it's not meant to be a ceiling on what kinds of industries we can attract.
Just to reinforce what I have said earlier, and that is, given a lot of folks that would read this plan and being casually familiar with the past, would read that as quite an exclusionary list, a document in terms of these are the things we're interested in as a city. And given the history, some folks would look at that, some potential
Sure.
employers would look at that and say, well, there goes Eugene again. They're not interested. So I think caution in how we present ourselves and the possibilities is really important.
Sorry, Rick, go ahead. Okay. One of the other things, and I know it's kind of in here in a variety of places, and maybe it can be done in our letter or whatever else, but I think it's real important for us to be very specific with regard to our local businesses, that the city is truly here to support their growth. And although it's kind of sprinkled through, it's, again, I hear a lot of people say, gee, the city, I'm already here, and yet the city wants to go find everybody else. I really want you to help me do things. And unfortunately, I think that there's a kind of an attitude out there that the less the city knows about me, the better off I am when it comes to business. And I'd like to see us really be more promoting that the city is going to really help you do things. I mean, I know Development Community does, Metro Partnership does to a certain extent, but we're never really out front saying, we're open for your business to help you do what you want to do. And I'd like just to see that always strongly stated, because we all know that most of our employment's going to come from within. It's not coming in with the next new best shiny business from somewhere else. It's here, it's homegrown. And unfortunately, as we all know, we're tending to be just the opposite. We continually lose our businesses to somewhere else, and I understand there's one or two more going to announce leaving the community here shortly. And so I'd love to see us get out ahead of this curve that we don't seem to be getting ahead of at this point. And this document, to me, I'd love to see that kind of stuff strengthened.
Sure. I mean, I think along with the last point, we can't make those points loudly enough or more clearly, because it is sprinkled throughout here, but it's also easy for someone to read a policy and think we're just trying to put all our eggs in the giant semiconductor basket, which is definitely not part of the plan. It's a balanced plan. And I guess just, and you're probably aware of this, but just for everyone's benefit, I think there's a number of things we're doing every single day where we're showing, not telling people how we're open for business. And more, there's a lot of, there are as many success stories, and people hear the highlights, and I'm not particularly aware of any businesses currently that may be announcing to leave, but we work very hard to retain local businesses. We're working very hard to get things done, and I think Eugene has a changing reputation for a place where you can do, where we will work very hard to help businesses prosper and grow and locate here. And so there's a number of examples recently. I mean, not just the work around redeveloping the Woolworth building and the Beam building and LCC, riverfront research kind of stuff. I mean, there's been a number of occasions where the headline has been that the developer or the owner, whoever, has been very pleased by the city's action and effort. And so I think those are the stories we need to tell more and more. And I don't want people to get the sense that we're closed for business. And I know that there's perceptions, and you have to work really hard, and it takes a long time to change those perceptions. But I think that we can say those more clearly to help convey that message.
Yeah, it was interesting in the paper over the weekend about the 19th and Agate area, how, there is a perception this year the city's actually going to help that area, versus I think they felt that they were sort of stepped on at the trials last time by taking all the on-street parking away and doing a lot of things that really made those businesses suffer a lot. And so I was happy to see in that article there's a real discussion to help them. I thought it was also interesting that a comment was made that, the city spends so much time concentrating on downtown, but those people pay taxes to pay salaries in the city, and they don't feel like they're getting their just due, which I got from the article at least, that they're feeling that is changing, that the city is actually looking outside of just planning everything to be downtown, because we have a lot of these small business hubs all over the place that need help too from the city. So I thought that was a nice clarity in that article.
Commissioner Belcher.
I remember from the CRG, Pat Johnson suggested the idea of a green business incubator. Can you tell us where we are with that?
Well, that's actually reflected in one of the strategies. We talked about it. I thought it was last time. Maybe it was the time before.
3A.
It's under economic.
It's on page 2, 3A.
So again,
So
we're
it's
setting
moving
policy
forward.
direction,
Okay.
and that's in there.
Okay, I see it there. I was just wondering.
Yeah.
To be done. Got it.
Yeah. It's on the long list of to-dos.
And I think, again, I'll just go ahead and say that I think the city, with the state's economic gardening plan, that I'd like to see the city sort of become a little more vocal about the use of that program, because at least what we understand from our APA meeting last year, that it was very successful in its pilot program, and that now it's available statewide, and I think we should be having businesses help do that. And I know I talked to the chamber a lot about getting that information out to all the businesses also.
What is it, Rick?
It was a pilot program where they went in and they actually hire somebody, and they have thresholds, and I think if I remember right, you have to have gross revenue somewhere above $10 million. It's the idea to help those businesses take the next step in economic development, so that they will, and the organization that works helps them find and create markets outside of Oregon. And the state actually pays for it, and they've shown that actually the employee gain is so far below some of the other economic programs that have done in the past that they've been very, very successful at it. So it's the idea of trying, again, to people who don't have marketing departments or study or analysis groups that can come in or they don't have them on staff to do this, the state actually pays to have somebody go out and help them find the next market, with the idea that it'll help Oregon grow if we can bring dollars from outside Oregon into our state here versus always exporting or simply just moving the money around our own bucket within our small community. So it actually sounded like it was a very, very successful program. It just needs help, and I think it's something that the city can be real involved with.
Well, I'll jump into it. I think as we look at some of these incentives for encouraging economic development and that, I wouldn't limit us just to the Beam property and some of the larger projects, but I think as we go through, as I've been looking at the maps, there's a lot of little parts and pieces and little tiny infill properties that the little guy is going to develop, and really helping move those forward and be able to do some of those infills, I think will be critical too, because again, and I know we've got, I think, a policy for encouraging the infill, but I think really as we get into the implementation, some of those strategies as far as really making that easier and smoother, I think it's more likely to happen. And so it's not just the bigger things downtown, which is great, and I'm glad to see it, but some of those little parcels that are just scattered throughout, I think it'd be good to identify, well, maybe not identify those, but just have some implementation strategy as we get into it on how to do that.
Other comments, questions? The economic development? So, are we done with this part? I think we are.
Take a half-hour break.
Well, I think we might need the time elsewhere, so we'll keep going. Which brings us next to the draft document prepared by Commissioner Leddick. And some brief discussion about how we should proceed through this. I presume everybody's had a chance to read and review it. And I'm wondering if we should just go page by page or paragraph by paragraph, or Commissioner Belcher?
First of all, thank you, Randy, for putting this together. It's excellent. Huge. And I was fortunate enough to sit by the river while I was waiting for the marathoners to come by and read through it, and really appreciated the quality of it. For me, it would be helpful if we clarified up front how we are going to deal with minority positions, as it were. Are we going to have separate input in another document at the end of this, or should we try to weave it in as we go? If we knew that, then it would make it easier to figure out how to adjust the document. And I'm open to suggestion.
Well, I was just going to, if I can, talk in general about, it's, as we look at, and I think I said this one of the first conversations where we met to start talking about the recommendation. This is a different sort of animal for the Planning Commission in the sense that a typical process, it would have been much more wholly funneled through sort of the Planning Commission having a role in, the public involvement process. We set about to do a different kind of a community process here. And so, as you know, the Community Resource Group, the TRG, has done a tremendous amount of work. There's a recommendation on the streets from the city manager. Planning Commission, Sustainability Commission, other folks will weigh in, both formally and this type of written testimony, also at the public hearing. And then the city manager, based on staff pulling together everything we've heard, the forums, will make we'll comment back to the council. Do we hear something that would cause us to make a tweak to the recommendation? Council then obviously will deliberate and give us some direction on how to move forward. And so the way we've been sort of framing this is, it is our hope, and I think we have largely been successful in creating a policy framework that most of the people feel pretty okay about. Not everybody loves every aspect of it. There's a few areas on the margins that people have some concerns about or would like to tweak or suggest a little stronger policy set to accomplish a goal or cautionary, whatever that is. And so, but it's also a very carefully woven together set of policies that if you pull on one piece, another piece comes out. And so we're trying to keep that fabric of that whole, because I think that's how the process worked. And so to the extent that the Planning Commission is sharing its collective wisdom and expertise in planning with the council to help them make their policy decisions, it's most helpful for you to try to come to that similar collective wisdom, which doesn't mean that you couldn't have a minority report, but it's a different kind of process than that. And so I guess in general, I would hope that you can get to the area of what you do agree on or don't agree on and not get into the details that would really lend itself to a minority report. It's obviously your pleasure how you move forward with this, but that's just sort of my framing from a staff perspective.
Maybe it'd be helpful if I got more specific.
Sure.
I feel it necessary to state the case for a different mix for multiple single-family housing, and I'm wondering how I get to do that.
Mr. Levitt.
Yeah, I'm glad you gave a specific. What was interesting for me is I attempted to consolidate the kind of mishmash of comments that were made here as we went through this for 3 or 4 meetings. Some of them were identified specifically on a particular strategy, and in some cases even down to a particular tactic. Others were not. Others were kind of went through and talked about this and talked about that. And in the organization of this, what I tried to do was consolidate those comments at the strategy level. When a specific comment was made about a particular tactic or a suggested particular implementation approach, I tried to capture the word of that, but not get to the detail, not get to the minutia that we think. Just for example, Steve Baker's recommendation that we include bedroom count in the ordinance as we calculate dwelling unit density. I mention it, but I don't necessarily suggest that this needs to be part of EC 9.506 something or other, that kind of minutia. And so, very specifically, I remember when we had the discussion about housing mix, it seemed that you were not ready to move on with that. And that's why I specifically put the general statement in there that some commissioners wanted a higher single-family to multiple-family mix, others wanted the opposite. But generally speaking, the majority of the Planning Commission agreed where it was. So what I tried to do is capture the essence of all of that without making too much of a case one for the other. So what I think probably needs to do, and as I mentioned this to Jeff, I'm not the guy to scribe changes in this from now on. I think what I can do is shoot it out to everybody with the Word document, and if you have very specific language that you would like to see incorporated in it, I think then we share that with one another, specific tweaks. We're at the point where how we decide whether we all want to put that in there or not, I'm not quite sure. This is just the thought capturing document where we have it so far. So I don't know how to answer your question.
Well, and I understand the desire for all of us to come together along the lines of the CRG, but there was a range of opinions there as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
And in fact, this very issue was one that was not resolved in the CRG. I'm comfortable with what you wrote. It just doesn't give me a venue to plight my case. And I feel the need to plight my case. Forgive me for needing to do that, but I want to know, do I need to do it individually, or will it be part of this document?
Would you have an objection to doing it individually?
No.
Well, I could also just, you have done this in the past where you've had, a majority or, most of, whatever the number fallout is, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, I don't think you have to actually list, John Belcher feels this way. If John Belcher feels this way, you can submit something as a private citizen or as a neighborhood leader to that effect. As a planning commission, I think you could say, the conversation focused on this. A number of commissioners or a commissioner expressed an interest in moving towards a different mix. I think that for the council to hear, that's what's important for them to understand what happened rather than to be a vote. I guess I'm trying to keep you from reflecting votes, because this isn't that kind of a process.
I agree, and I think that that number one, where it's kind of a general statement about the discussion, I could, possibly that stays, but then a second paragraph is added that says, for these reasons, at least one commissioner supported a different mix. If you guys are comfortable with that.
See, if one commissioner on the commission suggests a higher multiple family to single family ratio, I know that there would be another commissioner on the commission who would be inclined to want to argue the other way.
Right.
And then we get into...
Then we're taking a vote.
That case was kind of stated in our original housing mix letter back in September.
Which we can reattach we can include along with this as a supporting document for the work that you've done.
Or a revised
Or revised, that's
Because I think we were kind of split in that regard back even then. Yeah.
I think I was in a different place at that point in time, too, so that makes it a little more challenging.
And it's a different composition of the
Yep.
commission now also.
It is.
I don't want to, be the burr in the saddle, but I also feel this is a strong issue that I think I want to espouse the reasons why I want to see the position move. And frankly, it's not reflected here. I want the council to hear it. I also don't want to create dissent in the commission. So tell me what to do and I'll do it.
I would suggest it would be appropriate to do it individually.
I'm more than happy to do that if that's what you want. And I'm quite comfortable with that, seriously.
Well, and we've always...
Hopefully you will do the same, if you wish.
Now that I know you're gonna.
See, there goes one thread, there goes another.
Well, this is the only thread I'm pulling on at this point.
Commissioner Duncan.
Yeah, when I read through this over the weekend, unfortunately I don't have my notes here because my computer is not running today, and that's where they all are. There's not a lot, but I actually thought more of talking about this idea of not making this necessarily a recommendation, but calling it either Planning Commission observations or something like that, along with what you were talking about. So it was really more related to the discussions that we were having, and not necessarily sort of a consensus document for all of us. It's sort of the way that I've approached this. It's kind of like what we do with the TRG and other things. We have people that don't agree, and we still move on because we're there as an advisory, trying to get all of our thoughts out so that staff can then kind of work with all the thoughts that were presented. And in this situation, the council would take a look at the way we did things. So, I think it would be appropriate, even in this document, for a discussion with regard to the sort of the mix, because nobody seems to be going to the 40-60. We're either sort of 50-50 to 60-40, is really kind of talk about that whole range of things. I'm sort of the mind that, as I said even way back, the housing mix to me doesn't really matter in my mind, because we're not going to achieve some particular mix because we state it in a document. It does require us to take a look at doing things maybe differently depending on what housing mix is talked about. But if it's truly we want to have less housing mix because I don't want to push the urban growth boundary, there are an enormous amount of challenges coming with a 50-50 because we don't have the room yet to be able to put even the 55-45 split, much less the 50-50 split. So there's a lot of real challenges to do any of this stuff, and I'd rather see us kind of have that discussion about anywhere from 60-40 to 50-50, what the different challenges are, and sort of bring that to the city council, because if I believe there's kind of a shortage of understanding. It's around what these different things are, because it's sort of that approach, it's a whack-a-mole, okay, we can go 50-50, but now we're whacking on a different hole than we were if we go 55-45. They're still popping up all the problems. So I'd rather sort of see that kind of discussion come out of the document, and that's kind of the way I was starting to look at it more, was really trying to explain to them some of this stuff, because I'm one that's been drinking for the fire hydrant for 3 or 4 years now, and everybody else is here too. The city council hasn't even had the fire hydrant turned on yet, and I think that what we can do,
I believe they have.
not as much as some of the rest of it, but maybe so. But I think, when I talk to some of them individually, I can see that they're still not even, I won't say not grasping, but there's some challenges for them to understand the whack-a-mole process that's going on, because it's not an easy fit anywhere. So that would have been my suggestion on this document, to do it that way, which then allows everybody to feed in the parts they want to feed into it.
Can I just clarify something? Not specifically on the housing mix, but your earlier comment about this not being so much a recommendation paper, I tried intentionally not to make it a recommendation paper. I talked about collective comments, observations, and thoughts. I steered clear of recommendations. So that's all it is a collection of...
No, in no way am I reflecting on what you wrote.
Right.
It's
No,
just how
me
do we
neither.
deal
Me
with the
neither.
difference of the
No, me
whole.
neither. I didn't mean to suggest that.
Okay.
I thought you did an excellent job of that.
Yeah.
Mr. Jaworski?
I probably was one of the minority on the split.
Yes, you were.
Okay, and I went along with it because of all the threads Lisa talks about. I figured, okay, basically because my assumption was if we look at something every 5 years, maybe that can come up for reconsideration. I don't know, because it's unclear what we look at every 5 years. And the second thing to me was why I keep bringing up timing. And the timing is some of these other things, and that goes in with when I was reading this, because you keep bringing up the master studies for Clear Lake and Bailey Hill, Gimble Hill. You bring it up again over here under this, and to me, I see that as not being done until year 10 and 15. And I keep talking about that because number one, if we did have a different mix, we wouldn't even need to have them in the picture as far as expansion areas. And number two, and I would have said it later when we get down to these, but it's all related, is that I don't think we have a lot of resources in this city, and there are a lot of neighborhoods out there that need help and need help now for the same kind of planning you want to give to, maybe immediately, because it's mentioned so much, to 2 new areas coming in. And I don't think that that's fair to the existing neighborhoods who are here, because they've been looking for help. They need something to help them move along and accommodate this growth or deal with the growth issues that have been occurring in their area. That's why I'm so on this timing issue. But if someone tells me we're going to go right out to these 2 places and begin this in the next year or 2 years, then I would have been very, very strong, and maybe that's not the correct mix. But if it's later, because I think, and it says in this, we can accommodate 90% of the growth within the urban growth boundary. Well, it seems to me that that's where our emphasis should be, in those areas, and it's stated, this is our priority, we want to see it happen here first. But I've been told that once this area is annexed, it's like open to market demand, and everybody's going to run out there, especially if it's treed and it's nicer looking at maybe what's here. That's what my problem is that it's like a donut thing. We have this hole that needs help, but we're going out on the donut, and we know that that's where it's going to go. So that's where my concern is with the mix, unless the timing and all that is pretty clear on when things are going to happen.
Can I clarify? Yes. Yeah, John, I tried to capture your thoughts in a number of places, and sorry I didn't number these pages, but for example, one area says, means of addressing neighborhood issues that should not be expected to wait for resolution until an area plan can be initiated and formulated. Included in here too, where is it? I just saw it. Should underline it while I had it. The part about, resources should be devoted to initiating and completing these plans, i.e. area plans and neighborhood plans, at a rate faster than at least one neighborhood every 2 years. I think that was your comment.
I agree. You also mentioned parks and that we should consider, I have that all, I think it's great. But the problem is I don't know who makes these other decisions. When I'm reading that, which is open to interpretation, and I'm reading in 3 other spots and in this whole document, Lake, Bailey Hill, we need to do master plan, we need to do this. It's a lot more stronger than those words, and I think it's going to happen earlier. And that's why I'm saying, matter of fact, I wrote here, it should specifically indicate that this may not need to be done until year 10 or 10, 15. And if people feel that can't happen, then I'm really upset about the way the mix is that's causing these area neighborhoods, although they have needs that you've identified, are going to fall behind. That's what I feel.
Yeah. It's going to become really a matter of resource availability, too.
Clarifying question. Should we move the urban growth boundary and bring in, say, Bailey Hill in that area, even if we don't extend services to that area, the developer can propose to provide those services or pay for those services, and then things move forward? So even
They would
if
be
we
required
do-
to.
Pardon? Well, they'd be required to, but they can initiate the process, such that if we say we're not going to expand for 10 or 15 years in that area, if the developer says, I'm ready to go, how do we keep that from happening?
We can't afford it.
That's a good question. There's a number of different ways that services do get extended. More often than not, I believe that it's the city coming in kind of with the trunk line infrastructure, right? What you're, I think, kind of speculating about is, well, okay, so the city says they're not going to do that till year 10 or 15 or something. But what's to stop a developer who has annexed their property to say, I'm going to foot the bill? And I believe, we should, do we have any staff here? I believe that there is a mechanism for that to happen where a developer does
There's definitely a mechanism for that.
It's the
front
primary
that,
mechanism.
front that, and then other people pay as they develop. And so it's a good question. It's one that I don't think anyone here has the answer to right now, but we could look into.
So that's why I think that's a significant issue.
Try again.
Oh, that's okay. Well, I too want to thank Randy for consolidating all of our comments. And I guess the way I viewed this was really kind of a summary minutes of our discussions that we've had. And so, if we're really not, we've had our discussions, and this is to bring the city council into maybe what those discussions were without saying, we think you need to do this, this, and this specifically. Because, we've listed the things that I think kind of rose to the surface as being important to us because of our discussion. And then, I guess it's kind of getting away from taking the vote, saying, the Planning Commission voted 4-3 to recommend this. Because, again, it's kind of that policy direction. And I think I kind of agree with Rick on the percentage mix, and I understand, depending on the percentage mix, we may or may not need Clear Lake or Gimple Hill, but the mix is going to kind of be what the mix is, I think, and as we move forward. So there's going to be pressures all along the way. And we can either not bring it in and then land prices go up like they've done, and or people head to Harrisburg and Junction City, or we can kind of try and hit that balance. And I guess that's what I'm seeing us maybe trying to do here, is hit that balance. And for me, with that balance, I shifted from the 60-40 to 55-45 because I think I think I just shifted my thinking on that. But anyway, I guess I've said enough.
Well, I'll wait for after Commissioner Felcher.
I think the problem is, first of all, this is the only area where we have significant minority dissent.
I'm not sure of that.
Well, that's the one I'm most aware of. And unfortunately, it has two implications. One is, how do we develop the city? as far as the mix, and the other one is where do we expand the city because of the mix. And one is easier to deal with than the other, in my opinion. If we hit the percentage wrong, we can adjust. Once we've brought something in the urban growth boundary, I don't think we're going to take it back out again, or even whether we can. So there's short-range issues and there's long-range issues, and my concern is over the short-range issue. And that's what I want to express. And for a number of reasons, and they're whack-a-mole reasons.
And I guess that point, what I was going to add, and along the comments that you just made, I think, I go again back to, we have pulled together this collective inputs on all these different issues and tried to come up with, for lack of a better word, the sweet spot. We tried to hit the greatest balance. And so, yep, there are people who are saying, I can live with it, I don't love it, but I can live with it, or I would have asked for more, but I'm willing to make a concession because I believe that we need to move forward. We need to have a plan in place that achieves our goals, and we think this is the best plan we can put forward that gets at the greatest number of people's interests that we have heard from, and we have really exhaustively heard from everyone in the community we have been shaking the trees to hear from everybody. And so I think the comments that you make, I really appreciate, Commissioner Rendell, because people, if you can argue, the Planning Commission can make a comment that says there's a concern that we continue moving towards a different mix, or that we bring everything we can to bear to achieve a different mix, recognizing that it's not an exact science, things will change, we don't know what the market's going to bear. I think there's some luck, for lack of a better word, that the economy is actually giving us some time to plan this, and that there's not going to be 100 people lining up. There may be one person, but there's land inside the urban growth boundary now that hasn't expanded. There's a lot of work and investment that would have to happen for that area to expand first, and we are going to make sure that our policies and implementation strategies do everything we can to densify and take the greatest advantage of our land within the urban growth boundary, and also to allow opportunity to happen in other places with good planning. And so that's where I don't think it's all that constructive, and I'll just say that. At the risk of offending anybody, I don't think it's that constructive to try to take votes, because it wasn't a vote-type plan, and there's too much work has gone into it that can quickly unravel if you start doing that, and then you go back to that polarizing perspective that we've worked, and I think very successfully made some gains towards a different kind of outcome in this plan. And so I think it's the more observations, the more concerns, the more hopes and goals that you want to see us move towards, I think need to be reflected for council's consideration, because you're helping them by having spent a lot of time on this, and they have spent a lot of time on this as well, but you're helping them navigate the issues. They want to hear what they are and make sure that they've all been raised, and then they will land as policymakers on the right set. Ultimately, they take votes.
Take the vote, yeah.
Sure. Duncan.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things, since I'm one of the ones that really worked on this land issue, is that the area that actually is being talked about for expansion is beyond one of the areas that's currently inside the UGB that is completely underutilized, that has no services in it. So my point is that we're going to really utilize already current lands inside long before we get to the expansion area. When I read this, I know we're talking about master planning areas that if we bring them into the urban growth boundary, but I really believe that just through the process of even expanding into the lands that we already have within our urban growth boundary, that is a long ways out there in the future. The cost to certainly to send services out to the area we're talking about expansion is multiples and multiples of millions of dollars. And so I'm not overly concerned that somebody's going to rush out and start developing the area out there that's being annexed in, being expanded into, because there's so much land that we already have that we can't serve right now that's got to get services to it, that we already have within our urban growth boundary that we can't use now because we don't have the services. But those lands I know that we talked about at TRG, truly it's those lands that we've worked on trying to make sure that we could get services to, so that we didn't have to really go further. And I hear Commissioner Jaworski's concerned. I don't believe that I've heard that staff says that these master plans are going to be immediate. I think it's a recognition that there's a whole lot of stuff between where we currently have services and where these expansion areas are. Maybe not so much Clear Lake as the Gimple Hill area, I think that what we've had and what we're talking about here does need to go into the documents. I think that raising the issue about timing of an expansion area when something's done is certainly appropriate to be put into a document for City Council to consider. I think that's what they're looking for us to make sure that they recognize we're doing those things. So that they can really understand. It's one of the things I've talked about with redevelopment and with brownfields and everything else is they need to understand that there's true costs associated with all of these things, and they just need to be continually made aware of these things. So I don't have a problem with talking about the different issues in this document, because I think there are things that we want to make sure that they're really aware of as they try to make decisions on these things.
Mr. Belcher.
I think
I'm
one-
sorry, Jaworski, sorry, Joe.
Okay. First of all, I want to say to Randy, I think you did an excellent job here. It's too bad I mentioned a comment that I had of concern first, virtue of the fact that I have like 12 yeses on this thing. So I do want to indicate that I like what I hear Commissioner Duncan saying, and that if this was viewed as minutes, I only see a couple of amendments. I mean, if the discussion, as indicated, could clarify in the beginning that there was a discussion from 60-40 to 40-60, and we virtually went in this direction, I think that's great, and indicating that we also discussed the ramifications. If we went one way, urban growth boundary wouldn't be needed to be expanded. If we went another way, it would. I'd also like to see added into that it is our understanding that those areas mentioned in the expansion area, and I want to be specific, aren't looked at like 10 to 15 years down the way, because we see the growth of 90% occurring within the existing UGB, and if growth is developed out there as far as demand is concerned, that it be paid for by the developer themselves. If that's clear and understood in there, then I'm going like, wow, then this document pretty much reflects what I think I heard, at all the meetings, and the only other comment I wanted to have is on the next to last page, item number 6, on the great conversation on parks. I think we did talk about that, and I don't know whether I was, again, maybe in a minority here, but we did talk about under parks, which is, I guess, the next to the, well, it's the page, they're not page, but right before protect, restore, and natural resources, the number 6 there. I thought we also had a discussion that there should be some consideration taken in when we're looking at parks, that buying and acquiring parkland under whatever the connotation park means, and then assigning it to a school to be an athletic facility for the school isn't necessarily a park for the community. And I thought we had that discussion, and I would have liked to have seen more there saying that, it's not available to them during the day, and in the evening, it may not be available to the demographics of that area because it's a sports park. It's fenced in, more than likely. It's even used in the evenings because they have lighted fields now that they all practice on. So it's not really, from my perspective, a park, and it's not available to the community, and that something should be looked at, that although this might be a way to save money and not having to develop it with park funds, but with 4J school district funds, it's not a park.
I understood your comment to be with the school closed, the impact of school closures. I didn't.
They're both there.
Yeah.
I think I raised that one.
But other than that, I thought a lot else, that's the only issues I have with this multi-page document. It was like, I thought, very well reflected what we had talked about.
Commissioner Belcher.
Well, I think our conversation is a little bit confused because we're arguing two things at once, whether the percentage is correct and should we reflect more minority positions. And I think it's not appropriate to have the percentage conversation, although I understand why we're doing it. I would suggest, as Commissioner Laddick suggested, that I would like to submit 2 or 3 sentences to be added in the mix of the range of discussion, and I trust you would too, and we could include that as basically proposed by Commissioner Duncan, and then we're still reflecting what we said, and frankly, Council, I feel, needs to hear all the perspectives, and this, although reflects that we had some difference, doesn't say why, and I think it's important that they hear it.
here are my comments, thoughts, and observations on this discussion. Now that we've had the closure on the industrial lands, I'll, as quick as I can, put together the summary minutes and include them in the document and then shoot it out in Word to you all. And what I'd suggest everybody does is by noon Friday, make your very specific comments in your copy of the Word document and then shoot those to the rest of us. And then when we come back together on Monday, we can go through it paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, and say, yeah, let's include that in there, or no, let's modify that sentence this way or that, and go from there. And again, try to keep it at a 30,000-foot level and as non-confrontational as possible.
And if you can include staff on that so that we could come prepared to provide any information that would be helpful in your resolving your proposed changes.
Resolving our proposed
And
observations.
I guess I would agree with that. I know as I went through, I just made little red marks and kind of just little wordsmithing things of, this word might be, suggest a different word, that kind of thing. And I didn't think that was really something we were going to get into today, but I thought as it goes out, we could just make those suggestions.
I just wanted to say I appreciate staff's desire to keep us together on this, and I hope we can find a way to do it.
Hurting. I wasn't thinking cats. I was thinking more like...
Just leave it where you left it.
Micro livestock.
Micro livestock, exactly.
Is that in here? I didn't catch that.
Yeah, it is.
I'll have to find that part
You don't
again.
have to worry about
So it sounds like we've got a path forward for generating the next draft. The first step is, once again, with Commissioner Leddick to draft an economic development section, after which it'll be forwarded to us, and we'll be able to generate comments for distribution to all commissioners and staff, with the goal being to get back together a week from today and review the possible changes.
And on that, I think, Lisa and Carolyn, it's probably important that we not have a whole lot of discussion
Yes.
on the internet.
Do not, right, I would actually, that's a very good point. You're not deliberating, I mean, this isn't a land use action in that sense, but I would like to suggest, or reiterate your suggestion, which is provide specific text changes in a track changes mode, send it back so everybody can see them, we'll pull them all together. We'll try to put them in one document to send back to you so we all have the same document for Monday's meeting, and not add specific opinions around, I like that or don't like that. We'll have that conversation here in a public setting.
And so, close of business Thursday better?
Probably, that would give us Friday to
So
turn
if
it
I have
around.
this by noon to everybody on Thursday, that's enough.
All right. This one we can start on.
11:30.
Actually, how about sending this to us now?
Let me put the whole thing together. It
Well,
won't take me long to put that
okay.
together.
I guess I would ask if we're going to do that to, a lot of us use different kinds of software, so what you think may show up on yours or does show up on yours may not show up on mine. So there's got to be a good way to check them, so I would suggest you do them in a different color print, because I think all softwares will reflect a different color print, because I know I've got some occasionally, and they still come out as black and white, and it's hard to find some
And
change.
you could also, if it's easier to people, if you don't have track changes available to you and you want to mark something up and PDF it back to staff, we can take those all and verbatim include the changes that you've made and send it back to everybody.
Or even use bold type and underline.
However,
Legislative.
well, that's the same, track change, everyone has different software, so whatever works that allows you to change it, we'll be responsible for pulling it all together, if that's okay, and send it back out, so that, I'm just presuming, Commissioner Leddick, that you didn't want that task.
I appreciate that.
Would there be value in annotating the suggested changes by who suggested them, or would that be more problematic?
No, I think actually we can do that in a Word format that would have them be different people. We can figure that out.
Okay. And Word 2007 is fine?
We can use it whatever version, as long as it shows up when you send it, when you look at it.
So then the plan is not to send it to each other.
You can send it to everybody, but we'll take them and put them all into one format, so don't feel like you, yeah.
Comment on each other's comments.
What I wonder is if, I'm worried about software differences. So when I send my annotated Word document to you, if I should include a PDF copy for...
I think the PDF works great. If you send us electronic, the non-PDF version as well.
Yeah, that's what I mean, send both.
Sure, and we'll just,
No matter what, you can at least see it, and
it's possible that you won't all be able to read everybody's as they come in, but you will get one version before Monday's meeting where you can.
Thank you. Imagine doing this in 1965.
a lot longer. It would
I
take
just
a lot
read
longer.
that last week was Administrative Professionals Week, and a group of administrative professionals who were polled, something like 86% of them said that they could bring back one piece of technology. It would be the electric typewriter. I thought that was interesting.
Bring that back.
Yeah. Just random, useless thoughts, facts.
Every office has one. Usually it's some old Selectric hiding in the
We still
corner.
have ours.
Because you need them when you need them.
Well, because government always tends to have those forms that you can't fill out.
Yep, that's right.
Are there, Commissioner Jaworski?
Yeah, there's some things, I just, to show maybe, I thought I was in all these conversations, just a little more clarification on maybe what a housing and a transportation affordability index is.
Lisa, can you?
We could certainly talk about that. So
You know what it is, or are you asking what it is?
I'm asking, yeah, it hits me and I'm going, housing, transportation, and
So
affordability.
it's a way of measuring factors that haven't been traditionally measured, and I'm not thinking right now who the first, not agency, but the group, that think tank sort of group that put that out there as a tool. It's so when people, for example, live, and I'll just use East Coast D.C. metro area as an example because that's often where it's looked at. So if you work in downtown D.C. and the housing affordability is so great, where to try to live close to downtown D.C., whether it's Alexandria or wherever, Arlington, Virginia, the people drive till they qualify, right? They drive farther out, so they're living in Maryland or farther out, sometimes 50, 60, 80 miles away. And so when the fact that the housing costs are looked at separate from transportation costs, but it's actually, in some cases, particularly when gas prices start spiking, that people's fuel costs get added $200 or $300. They can no longer afford the house that they once thought, or perhaps they could afford a different house closer to town if they factored in how much they're saving. So it's a way of bringing together those costs. And there have even been conversations in the national discussion around bank mortgages looking at those factors and qualifying people because it would, and they do in some areas. And there was a specific program that got defunded, I think, nationally that was supposed to look more at that. So if I'm reviewing somebody's loan application, I say, yep, your housing costs are $700 a month, therefore I'm going to, but their transportation costs go from $200 to $500 depending on the cost of fuel. That's a big swing. And so it's trying to factor those things in. So I think we could try to, something could be reflected to have a little bit more explanation about that without, I mean, I think you want to get away from having the document be a primary source of information, but reflecting.
And I guess if I could get you to expand just a little bit more, Lisa, in terms of, it's brought up in Vision Eugene.
Right.
It's carried in our recommendation. I just want to make sure I'm clear about how you envision that tool manifesting itself in Eugene. How would that, who would use it? How would it be presented or utilized?
So that itself is not a specific policy choice. It's more like a set of information, or it could be a tool that is used, whether over time, local lending. It's I mean, and Carolyn, help me out here, but it's more like a tool to help facilitate more of what you want to see happening.
Well, and the verbiage in the actual strategy says assess the applicability of it.
Right.
And so it is something that was brought up. It was of great interest to during community resource group discussions. We said, well, let's look into it and see how we would apply it.
Because I think I understand what the tool is. I'm
Right.
having a little bit of a reach understanding how it defines application.
Let me give an example that I think could be more tangible. Let's say there's an apartment complex going in downtown Eugene, and this has actually been true in British Columbia and Vancouver, so that when let's say they're condos, and they're market rate condos, if you purchase a condo and forego your real estate of the parking space, you actually get a better rate and a lower monthly payment on your condo. So those are incentives. They become economic development incentives. They're free market incentives that can get put into place to make something happen. So that's a recognition that, one, if you live closer to downtown, you probably don't need a car as much, or if there's flex cars available within the building, you might not. And so, two, there's an economic so right now in our community, particularly in certain neighborhoods, there's issues around cars and parking. But we're also not at a place where people are willing to say, we're not going to need cars. At some point, some people may rely less on cars. But if you have some economic incentives in place, I might readily give up my car if I can then qualify for a nicer condo with a larger square footage. So that's the example that has been used in Vancouver, where they actually make those kinds of market-based banking or qualifying incentives on a voluntary basis. They are not in any way requirements.
Just to clarify, you're talking Vancouver, BC.
Vancouver, British Columbia. Yep. So that's an example. So that's something. What's the applicability and what is the tolerance or interest in putting those kinds of incentives in place? The city could then develop an incentive package.
Okay, so it's more almost a site-specific. See, in my head, I thought, what are they going to do? Look at geographic areas and pricing and say that if you went to this area, you could actually, if if you're further than 2.5 miles out, it's actually cheaper for you to buy here, or would it be something that realtors would use?
Yeah, I mean that's another interesting angle on it. Is let's say that a lot of the things in here don't have to be things that the city does. A lot of this is really, it's all market based, and so perhaps there's a tool that realtors use that when you go to look at, and they're already, I mean, I think the walk score is more and more used in real estate, and both for investment and construction purposes. So there's a tool out there where somebody says, if I build in Bailey Hill, I'm going to add this kind of cost, and if I build here, I'm not. Having those things available, they're just layers of information that maybe help you get where you want to go.
Okay.
Commissioner Duncan.
Just to add on to that, there actually, if you Google it, there's a website where you can actually put in characteristics, and you can test your city and where it is and so on. So Google that index, and it'll pop up with a tool. I forget who does it. I think it's Portland State that does it, sort of monitors that locally. I'm not sure that, but I've gone in and played with it. Where we tend to see it more in our community is really sort of this test about living in Junction City or Veneta versus living in Eugene if you work here.
Right.
I've actually run it in town, and it's hard for it to do anything because we don't really travel that far from, even if you lived out at where I live or where you live into the core, we're only a couple of miles, so it's not like you're burning $25 or $30 worth of gas a day to get to work or something like that. But it is an interesting tool to study, and actually, if you Google it and find it, you can add in a lot of other components. You can add in utility costs. You can just add a variety of elements into it. So it's actually quite an interesting tool from a planning process.
And I think utility is one that is going to get added, and I'm thinking it's Congress for New America that does the tool on a national basis. But if you Google it, the information comes up, and for example, over time, having small footprint home incentive processes or incentives in place, because if you add a tool and you show that if you build a 3,500 square foot home versus a 2,800 square foot home, you have this cost savings per year, and then that translates to, again, qualifying or budget related things. It's just information that's helpful. They're not meant to be regulatory. They're meant to be helpful in incentivizing.
Commissioner Randall.
Well, and I think it is, just to tag on a little bit to what Rick was saying, I think it really is an education process for people, and I think that's the advantage that we have with this, because, people buy houses in Harrisburg, Junction City, or some of the outlying areas thinking that the house itself is cheaper, but it may be less energy efficient, so their utility costs are higher, their transportation costs are higher, and so where we've factored in the PITI in the past, we need to start adding in utilities and transportation and some of the other peripheral things that we haven't looked at traditionally, because gasoline's been so cheap, utility costs haven't been as much of an issue as maybe they are now, and so I think it's kind of that education process that we need to get to really understand the true cost of housing or those sorts of things. And I know in my education, 85% of the cost of a home is not the initial cost. The initial cost is only about 15%. The 85% is the maintenance, the utilities, the taxes, all of those things that are kind of those soft costs. And if you can have a more efficient, smaller home, see now I'm on my soapbox here, a more efficient, smaller home, not only are your utility costs less, your taxes are less, all of those things, your maintenance costs are less, and so all along the line, the true cost of that house is way less than what that initial cost might have been. So that's, I think, that educational process that we need to factor in as we're looking at some of these planning issues. I just think it's good to have that on the table.
Well, one final anecdotal piece of information, that when the fuel prices spiked in the D.C. metro area, there was a 6-month lag, but there was a housing foreclosure spike that they are linking to that because of that factor. So
It's about how far behind you get before they start to foreclose.
Any other discussion around the Gene Plan review? Commissioner Belcher.
I just wanted to compliment staff on a well-crafted document. We put a lot of effort into getting the theories and the beliefs in place, but you did an even better job of presenting them.
thank you. We have a fantastic team working, many of whom you don't see on a weekly basis.
Very solid.
Very good comment. Any others? Well, we're running a little early, but it sounds like we're to the point where I can ask if there are any other items from commissioners. Sounds like not. Any other items from staff? No. And then I'll ask, the last question is, how are we doing? How did we do today? How is it working for everybody? John?
Well, we had a tough issue, and I think we got to a place where we all feel comfortable on how to deal with it. So thank you for hearing me and being willing to work with me in particular.
I think we're kind of in unknown waters here a little bit in terms of we're outside of the commission's normal bailiwick, and I think everybody's kind of struggling to deal with it, and kudos to Commissioner Ledick for providing leadership on that.
Indeed.
Anything else? Then we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you all.